Is the past truly as quiet as some believe, especially when it comes to half of humanity? Did women really live in a world where their voices were muffled, their deeds ignored, and their stories lost to the ages, particularly during the 1,000 years known as the Middle Ages? What if the echoes of their lives are not silent at all, but instead resonate in unexpected places, waiting for discovery? What if the so-called silence is just a story we've been told, and the truth is far more intricate, far more vibrant, and far more vocal than you might imagine, specifically between the years 500 and 1500 CE? Number one, art and literature only depicted women as passive objects or stereotypes. Step into the intricate worlds of medieval art and literature, and you might expect to find women consistently portrayed as demure, silent figures, forever waiting on the sidelines. The common story suggests that women in these creative realms were limited to roles as saints on pedestals or damsels in distress, their agency stripped away, their personalities flattened into archetypes. But a deeper dive into manuscripts, sculptures, and literary texts reveals a much more dynamic and diverse landscape, one where women were not just passive objects of male gaze or storytelling. They were active patrons, complex characters, and even the subjects of powerful allegorical figures, challenging the idea of their two-dimensional existence. Consider the illuminated manuscripts that glowed with vibrant colors in medieval libraries. Flipping through these pages, you discover not only scenes of daily life, but also religious narratives where women take central active roles. Look at the depiction of the Virgin Mary, not always as a sorrowful figure, but often as a powerful Queen of Heaven enthroned, crowned, and commanding respect. She was depicted as an intercessor, a source of wisdom, and a figure of immense strength, challenging earthly powers on behalf of humanity. Beyond Mary, other female saints like Catherine of Alexandria were portrayed as intellectual giants, debating philosophers and emperors, their wisdom and courage shining through the artistry. Artists meticulously rendered scenes of their martyrdoms, yes, but often highlighted their unwavering resolve and inner strength, making them figures of admiration and aspiration, not just pity. These were not passive women, they were figures of immense spiritual and intellectual power. The roles of women as patrons of art and literature also tell a compelling story. Wealthy noblewomen and powerful abbesses did not simply accept what was given to them. They commissioned works, often dictating content, style, and even the specific scenes to be depicted. Think of patrons like Isabella of France, who commissioned sumptuously illuminated manuscripts, or Yolande of Savoy, whose prayer books were exquisitely crafted. Their names, sometimes inscribed directly into the manuscripts, signify their direct involvement and taste. These commissions were not merely acts of piety or vanity, they were expressions of power, intellectual curiosity, and a desire to shape their own spiritual and cultural landscapes. They chose specific texts, often including works by female authors or narratives featuring strong female characters, subtly influencing the artistic and literary output of their time. The very act of commissioning art and literature was an active statement, a visible mark of influence. Beyond religious art, women appeared in secular literature in equally varied and sometimes surprisingly nuanced ways. While romances often featured the archetypal beautiful lady for whom knights fought, many stories also presented women with agency, cleverness, and even cunning. Consider the figures in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. The wife of Bath is certainly not a passive figure. She is loud, opinionated, experienced, and fiercely independent, a woman who has controlled her own marriages and fortunes, challenging societal norms with her wit and her stories. Her prologue and tale offer a raw, unvarnished look at a woman's perspective on marriage, power, and desire, a voice that is anything but silent or stereotypical. Her character bursts forth from the page, a testament to the fact that medieval authors were capable of creating complex female personalities, not just cardboard cutouts. Furthermore, allegorical figures, often female, were widely used in medieval art and literature to represent abstract concepts like wisdom, justice, fortune, or the church itself. These figures were not static or submissive. As Lady Philosophy in Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, a hugely influential text, is a towering intellectual presence, guiding and teaching the imprisoned author. She is depicted as a powerful, wise woman who provides solace and intellectual guidance, her voice resonating with authority and reason. Similarly, Lady Fortune, often shown turning her wheel, controls the destinies of kings and paupers alike, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of life, embodying a powerful, if whimsical, form of control. These personifications, often embodied by women, granted them roles of immense symbolic power, far removed from any notion of passivity. Even in domestic scenes or representations of daily life, women were not always shown merely tending to household chores. Illustrations in books of hours or chronicles sometimes depicted women engaged in productive labor, managing estates, participating in harvests, or even acting as merchants in bustling markets. These images, while perhaps less grand than those of saints or queens, showcase the active and indispensable roles women played in the economic and social fabric of medieval society. They were shown as workers, entrepreneurs, and vital contributors, their presence visually undeniable. So, when exploring medieval art and literature, the narrative of women as solely passive objects or stereotypes quickly falls apart. Instead, you find a rich tapestry of representations: powerful queens, intellectual saints, assertive patrons, vibrant literary characters, and strong allegorical figures. These varied portrayals suggest that artists and writers and the societies that consume their work recognized a broader spectrum of female experience and power than is often acknowledged. The visual and textual evidence challenges the idea of a universal silence or a limited portrayal, offering a glimpse into a world where women's images, stories, and even their commissioned voices were anything but one-dimensional. The canvases, the pages, and the carved stone tell a story of women who were seen, depicted, and recognized in a multitude of roles, often possessing strength, agency, and an undeniable presence. Number 2. Women had no political influence. It's a common assumption that medieval politics was an exclusive arena for men, a brutal world of kings, knights, and bishops, with women relegated to the domestic sphere or acting merely as pawns in dynastic marriages. The image of a politically voiceless woman, existing only to bear heirs, persists in many popular narratives. However, a closer look at the actual historical records, the chronicles, letters of state, and administrative documents of the medieval period reveals a landscape where women, particularly those of the nobility and royalty, wielded significant and sometimes shocking political power. They were not merely bystanders, but active participants, regents, advisors, and even rulers in their own right, shaping the destinies of kingdoms and empires. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a figure whose life spans the 12th century, challenging any notion of political passivity. She was not just a queen, she was a duchess in her own right, inheriting one of the wealthiest and most powerful territories in France. Her marriage to Louis VII of France made her queen, but her strong will and independent spirit soon led to an annulment. She then married Henry Plantagenet, who became King Henry II of England, making her Queen of England. Eleanor traveled extensively, involved herself in court politics, and even raised armies and led rebellions against her husband. She acted as regent for her son Richard the Lionheart while he was on crusade and in captivity, demonstrating extraordinary political acumen and control over the vast Angevin Empire. Her diplomatic skills were renowned, and her influence extended across Europe. Her story, well documented in chronicles and letters, is a stark reminder that some women were at the very epicenter of medieval power struggles. Then there are figures like Isabella of France, who became Queen of England in the early 14th century. Her story is equally compelling. After years of a difficult marriage to King Edward II, she took matters into her own hands. She left England for France, gathered support, formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, and then launched an invasion that ultimately led to her husband's deposition. For a period, she effectively ruled England as regent for her young son, Edward III. This was not merely quiet influence, it was a dramatic seizure of power, demonstrating a ruthless political will and an ability to command armies and control the levers of government. Her actions sent shockwaves across Europe and were meticulously recorded by contemporary chroniclers, painting a picture of a woman who was a formidable political force, not a silent figure on the sidelines. Beyond queens, noble women often managed vast estates in the absence of their husbands, who might be away at war, on crusade, or serving at court. These women were responsible for collecting rents, administering justice, overseeing agricultural production, and maintaining feudal allegiances. They had to be skilled administrators, diplomats, and sometimes even military strategists, defending their lands and their families' interests. The records of manorial courts and estate accounts frequently show women acting as judges, landholders, and decision-makers, demonstrating practical, local political power that sustained the foundational economic structures of the medieval world. These were not minor responsibilities, they were critical to the functioning of society and the maintenance of noble power. Royal mothers often served as regents for their underage sons, a common practice throughout the Middle Ages. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, governed France with an iron fist for many years. She suppressed baronial revolts, negotiated treaties, and maintained stability during a turbulent period. Her letters and royal decrees clearly show her authority and her capacity to rule. Similarly, Empress Theophanu, regent for her son Otto III in the Holy Roman Empire in the late 10th century, was a highly educated and politically savvy Byzantine princess who navigated complex German politics, solidified imperial power, and even led military campaigns. Her presence on official documents and her diplomatic correspondence speak volumes about her significant political role. Women also exerted political influence through less direct but equally powerful channels. They served as key advisors to their husbands, fathers, or sons, their opinions valued in matters of state. Their extensive kinship networks often formed the basis of political alliances, and their marriages were critical diplomatic tools. They could intercede on behalf of petitioners, secure patronage, and facilitate communication between different factions. The numerous letters seeking a queen's or noblewoman's intercession in legal cases or for favors underscore their recognized ability to influence powerful men and institutions. These women were not just ornamental, they were integral to the intricate web of medieval power dynamics. From managing vast estates and leading rebellions, to acting as regents and shaping national policy, the evidence from the medieval period contradicts the idea of women's universal political silence. The records are filled with instances of women making critical decisions, exercising authority, and directly impacting the course of history. They were not merely symbols or pawns, they were players in the grand political game, using their intelligence, connections, and determination to secure power, influence events, and leave an undeniable mark on the political landscape of their times. Their stories remind us that political agency, even in a patriarchal society, was often found in unexpected places, and women were far from absent from the centers of power. Number 3, ordinary women's lives were never recorded. It is a common belief that medieval history primarily concerns kings, queens, and powerful nobles, leaving the vast majority of ordinary people, especially women, in an unrecorded silence. The assumption is that their daily lives, their struggles, their small triumphs, and their interactions simply passed unnoticed by the scribes and chroniclers of the age. However, a deeper dive into specific types of medieval records reveals a surprising amount of detail about non-elite women, providing glimpses into their work, their families, their legal disputes, and their very existence. Their voices, though perhaps not self-written chronicles, echo through the administrative and legal documents generated by the routine functioning of medieval society. Consider the manorial court rolls, detailed records kept by local lords about their estates. These documents are a treasure trove of information about the lives of ordinary peasants, both male and female. Women appear frequently in these roles, not just as wives or daughters, but as individuals with legal standing. So you find them involved in land transactions, inheriting property, or buying and selling plots of land. They appear as plaintiffs or defendants in disputes over property boundaries, trespass, or unpaid debts. A woman might be fined for brewing ale that was not up to standard, indicating her role as an alewife and a participant in the local economy. Another might be listed as a witness to a crime or an agreement, demonstrating her presence and her recognized testimony within the community. These brief mentions, accumulated over decades and centuries, paint a vivid picture of women as active economic agents, property holders, and participants in local legal systems. Tax records, like the poll taxes or hearth taxes, also provide direct evidence of ordinary women. These records often listed households and their inhabitants, sometimes even specifying occupations. You might find a widow listed as the head of a household, responsible for paying her own taxes, signifying her independent status and economic autonomy. A woman might be identified by her trade, such as a spinner, weaver, or baker, showing her contribution to the local economy. While these records are statistical rather than narrative, they collectively demonstrate the pervasive presence of women in various occupations and their significant role in the tax base, indicating their economic importance to the crown or the lord. Coroner's inquests, which investigated sudden or suspicious deaths, offer another fascinating window into the lives of ordinary women. While grim, these documents often include the names of witnesses, many of whom were women, describing events they observed. A woman might testify about finding a body, or about an accident that occurred in a field or a workshop. Their statements were deemed important enough to be recorded by officials, providing concrete examples of women observing and recounting events in their communities. These are not grand narratives, but the raw, unfiltered details of lives lived, recorded because they were relevant to an official investigation. Guild records, while often highlighting male artisans, also frequently mention women. Many guilds allowed for the wives and daughters of master craftsmen to continue the trade if the husband or father died, ensuring the continuity of the business. Some guilds, particularly those in textile production like silk weaving or embroidery, were predominantly female. Their names appear in membership lists, regulations, and records of fines for quality control. These records show women as skilled laborers, entrepreneurs, and active members of economic associations, managing businesses, and contributing to the urban economy. Parish registers, which became more common in the later Middle Ages, recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials. While primarily focused on vital statistics, they consistently list the names of women as mothers, brides, and deceased individuals. These registers, though simple, mark the milestones of women's lives, confirming their existence within the community and their family roles. They are a testament to the fact that women were born, married, and died, and their lives were significant enough to be formally noted by the church. Even wills, often perceived as documents of the wealthy, were made by ordinary people, including women. A woman's will might detail her possessions, how they should be distributed, and who should inherit them. She might bequeath specific items of clothing, household goods, or small sums of money to family members or friends. These documents offer intimate glimpses into their material worlds, their relationships, and their final wishes, providing a direct, if posthumous, voice. So, while medieval chronicles might focus on battles and kings, the everyday administrative and legal records of the era quietly tell a much broader story. They reveal a world where ordinary women were active participants in the economy, held property, navigated legal systems, and were recognized as individuals within their communities. Their lives, far from being unrecorded, were meticulously noted in the very fabric of medieval bureaucracy. These fragmented pieces of information, when pieced together, form a powerful counter-narrative to the idea of women's historical silence, demonstrating their constant, undeniable presence in the mundane, yet vital, records of the past. Number 4. Religious life offered women no agency or intellectual outlet. The image of medieval nuns and religious women might conjure up visions of cloistered silence, lives of quiet contemplation, and perhaps limited opportunities for intellectual engagement or personal agency. The common perception sometimes suggests that religious life was a retreat from the world, offering women little beyond piety and obedience, silencing any aspirations for leadership or scholarly pursuits. However, the historical record dramatically challenges this view, revealing that religious communities were often vibrant centers of learning, artistic production, and significant administrative power, where women, particularly abbesses and mystics, found avenues for profound intellectual expression and wielded considerable authority. Consider Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, visionary, and polymath. Her life explodes the myth of female religious silence. She wrote extensive theological works, composed stunning musical pieces that are still performed today, penned scientific treatises on medicine and natural history, and engaged in voluminous correspondence with emperors, popes, and other powerful figures across Europe. Her visions, which she believed were divinely inspired, gave her the authority to speak out on matters of church reform and political morality. She traveled, preached publicly, and established her own independent monastery, demonstrating incredible administrative and leadership skills. Hildegard was not just a quiet nun, she was a powerhouse of intellect, spirituality, and organizational ability, her voice resounding across kingdoms through her writings and her actions. Her works are still studied, celebrated, and attest to her profound agency. Abbesses, the heads of wealthy and influential convents, held immense administrative and spiritual power. They managed vast estates, sometimes larger than those of secular lords, overseeing land, tenants, and numerous employees. They governed their communities, ensuring the spiritual well-being and practical functioning of their convents. They were often educated, literate women who oversaw libraries, scriptoria places where manuscripts were copied and illuminated, and schools. Many convents were centers of learning, preserving knowledge and producing new texts. For example, the Abbey of Gandersheim in Saxony, under the rule of powerful abbesses, was a major intellectual center, where figures like Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote Latin dramas and poetry, making her one of the earliest known female playwrights in the Western world. These abbesses were powerful leaders, navigating complex political and ecclesiastical landscapes, their authority recognized and respected. Mystics and visionaries, many of whom were women, also found profound avenues for agency and intellectual expression within religious life. Figures like Catherine of Siena in the 14th century were not cloistered. She was a Dominican tertiary, a laywoman living a religious life, who became a powerful spiritual and political figure. She wrote voluminous letters, dictated theological treatises, and even acted as a diplomat, mediating conflicts between Italian city-states and advising the Pope. Her influence was so significant that she traveled extensively, often with a large entourage, and was a force for reform within the church. Her writings are complex, profound, and deeply intellectual, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for theological thought and spiritual articulation. Other mystics, like Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English anchoress, lived a solitary life but left behind a profound theological work, Revelations of Divine Love, which explores complex theological concepts with remarkable originality and spiritual depth. Though physically secluded, her intellectual and spiritual voice reached beyond her cell. Similarly, Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century lay mystic, though not a nun, sought a religious life and dictated the first autobiography in English, The Book of Marjorie Kempe. Her book details her spiritual journey, her travels, her interactions with clergy and lay people, and her often challenging experiences as a woman asserting her spiritual authority. Her story is a testament to a woman finding her voice and agency through religious devotion, even when it meant defying societal expectations. Convents provided a space where women could be educated, often to a higher degree than their secular counterparts. They learned Latin, studied theology, philosophy, and music, and engaged in intellectual discourse. They often preserved and copied manuscripts, contributing directly to the transmission of knowledge throughout the medieval period. These communities offered an alternative to marriage and domestic life, providing a structured environment for intellectual growth, spiritual exploration, and leadership opportunities that were often unavailable to women in the secular world. The idea that religious life offered women no agency or intellectual outlet is clearly contradicted by the sheer volume of evidence. From the administrative power of abbesses managing vast territories and leading communities, to the profound theological insights and political influence of mystics and visionaries, to the role of convents as centers of learning and manuscript production, medieval religious women carved out significant spaces for themselves. Their voices, whether through written treatises, administrative decrees, musical compositions, or personal spiritual narratives, were not silenced but amplified within the sacred walls, impacting not only their immediate communities but also the broader intellectual and spiritual landscape of the Middle Ages. Number 5. All women were illiterate and uneducated. When we think of medieval education, images of monasteries filled with male scribes and universities exclusively for men often come to mind. This can lead to the widespread assumption that women across all social strata were largely illiterate and denied any form of formal education. The idea of a universally uneducated medieval woman, dependent on men for access to knowledge, is a persistent one. However, historical evidence paints a far more nuanced picture, showing that literacy and education among women varied significantly by social class, religious vocation, and even practical necessity, revealing pockets of surprisingly high literacy and intellectual engagement. For noblewomen, education was often an integral part of their upbringing, though its purpose might differ from that of men. They were typically educated within the household by tutors, governesses, or learned clergy. This education often included reading and writing, not only in their vernacular language, but sometimes also in Latin or French, depending on their social standing and geographical location. They learned to manage large households, which required literacy for accounting, record-keeping, and correspondence. They also learned about courtly etiquette, music, needlework, and sometimes even basic medicine. Crucially, many noblewomen were taught to read for religious devotion, studying prayer books, psalters, and devotional texts. The existence of numerous lavishly illuminated books of hours, prayer books often commissioned by and for aristocratic women, points to a clear demand for personal reading material. Figures like Christine de Pizan, an educated woman in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, whose father was a court astrologer, received an exceptional education that allowed her to become one of the first professional female writers. Her very existence and her prolific output challenged the idea of universal female illiteracy among the elite. Within religious orders, literacy was not just encouraged, but often a fundamental requirement. And nuns in convents were educated to read and write Latin, the language of the church, for their daily prayers, study of scripture, and the copying of manuscripts. As mentioned earlier, convents like that of Hildegard of Bingen or the Abbey of Gandersheim were renowned centers of learning, where women not only copied texts but also produced their own original works. The ability to read and write was essential for the spiritual and administrative functioning of these communities. These women were not just literate, many were highly educated scholars, authors, and administrators, maintaining libraries and scriptoria that preserved vast amounts of knowledge. Even among urban women, particularly those involved in trade or managing businesses, a degree of practical literacy was often necessary. Women who ran inns, breweries, bakeries, or other small businesses in towns would have needed to keep accounts, write receipts, and manage correspondence. While not necessarily formal schooling, this functional literacy allowed them to participate actively in the bustling urban economy. guild records sometimes mention women needing to be literate to manage their family's trade if their husband died, indicating that such skills were not uncommon in certain urban professional contexts. Archaeological evidence, such as the discovery of writing implements, stylus, inkpots in contexts associated with women, or the presence of books in household inventories of middling families, also suggests a broader spread of literacy than previously assumed. These items indicate that reading and writing were activities that extended beyond the elite and the monastic walls, into the practical lives of some urban and even rural households. However, it is important to acknowledge that widespread literacy, especially among the rural peasantry, was indeed uncommon for both men and women. Formal schooling for the masses, as we understand it today, did not exist. But to claim that all women were illiterate and uneducated is to overlook the significant exceptions and varied levels of access to knowledge that existed across medieval society. The distinction lies in understanding that uneducated and illiterate were not universal female conditions, but rather varied conditions influenced by social class, location, and individual circumstances. So, while medieval education systems were certainly not universally accessible to all women, to paint all medieval women with the same brush of illiteracy is a significant oversimplification. From highly educated noblewomen managing vast estates and commissioning books, to scholarly nuns producing original works and maintaining libraries, to urban women needing practical literacy for their trades, women found diverse avenues for learning and intellectual engagement. Their ability to read, write, and engage with knowledge in various forms and for various purposes ensured that their voices and minds were not entirely silenced by a lack of education. The records show that many women were far from ignorant. They were active participants in the intellectual and cultural life of their times. Number 6, women's voices were only heard through men, husbands, fathers, confessors. The idea that medieval women were so legally and socially circumscribed that their perspectives and desires could only be expressed through the filter of a male relative or religious authority is a powerful, yet often misleading, historical narrative. It suggests that women lacked direct agency in legal, economic, or spiritual matters, their true voice is forever mediated by a man's interpretation or permission. While it is true that medieval society was patriarchal and women often faced legal limitations, particularly married women under common law, numerous historical records reveal instances where women spoke directly, asserted their own will, and acted independently, challenging the notion of their voices being exclusively funneled through men. Consider legal records such as court rolls and petitions. While a married woman might legally be represented by her husband in some common law jurisdictions, in many local courts, particularly manorial courts or urban borough courts, women appeared as plaintiffs, defendants, and witnesses in their own right. They initiated lawsuits, defended themselves against accusations, and provided testimony that was taken seriously by judges. For example, a woman might sue someone for a debt, a broken contract, or defamation. She might defend herself against charges of assault or theft. Their direct statements, recorded in these documents, demonstrate their ability to articulate their grievances, make their case, and seek justice without a male intermediary speaking for them. The sheer volume of women appearing in these local records, speaking directly, underscores their recognized legal agency in many day-to-day matters. Wills are another powerful example of women expressing their own voices and desires directly. While a woman's ability to make a will might depend on her marital status, a married woman's property might be largely controlled by her husband. Widows and unmarried women frequently created detailed wills. These documents were personal statements of intent, dictating the distribution of their property, designating guardians for their children, making religious bequests, and even expressing specific burial wishes. These were not wills dictated by fathers or husbands, but often carefully crafted documents reflecting the woman's own priorities, relationships, and spiritual concerns. They provide a direct window into her individual agency and her control over her own assets and legacy. Letters, both personal and official, offer some of the most intimate glimpses into women's independent voices. The Past in Letters, a collection of correspondence from a 15th century English gentry family, are a prime example. Women like Agnes and Margaret Paston wrote numerous letters, not just to their husbands, but to family members, tenants, and business associates. They discussed family affairs, managed estates, negotiated marriages, and even offered political advice. Their letters are filled with their distinct personalities, their anxieties, their frustrations, and their sharp intellect. These were not letters penned under male dictation. They were often autonomous communications expressing the women's direct thoughts and opinions, sometimes even challenging the decisions of their male relatives. Women, as patrons of art and literature, also exercised their own voice through their commissions. When a noblewoman or abbess commissioned a manuscript, a piece of artwork, or a building, she often had a significant say in its content, style, and dedications. These commissions reflected her personal taste, her piety, her political allegiances, or her intellectual interests. The specific choices she made, the text chosen, the imagery included, the artists employed were expressions of her own agency and her desire to shape her cultural environment. This was not a male-mediated voice, but a powerful statement of her own influence and vision. In the religious sphere, female mystics and visionaries often spoke with an authority that transcended traditional gender roles. As previously mentioned, figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena did not have their spiritual messages or theological insights filtered through male confessors. They spoke and wrote directly, believing their words were divinely inspired, and their authority was recognized by popes, emperors, and theologians alike. Marjorie Kempe, despite facing skepticism and accusations, insisted on the validity of her own spiritual experiences and dictated her extraordinary autobiography, ensuring her unique voice was preserved. These women found a powerful conduit for their voices that bypassed conventional male authority, directly engaging with complex theological concepts and challenging societal norms. Even in situations where women's voices were less formally recorded, their active participation in community life, in markets, at public gatherings, as healers, or as mourners at funerals meant they were heard, seen, and interacted with directly by their peers. While these daily interactions might not have left extensive written records, they underscore that women were not invisible or perpetually silent within their communities. The assertion that women's voices were exclusively heard through men does not stand up to the wealth of evidence. From direct appearances in legal proceedings and independent wills, to personal letters revealing their management of estates and family affairs, to their powerful commissions of art and literature, and the authoritative pronouncements of mystics, medieval women found numerous ways to express their own individual agency and articulate their perspectives. Their voices, though sometimes challenging to locate, resonate clearly from the historical record, demonstrating that they were far from perpetually silenced or mediated by male authority. Number 7. Women had no legal standing or rights. The prevailing image of medieval women often includes the idea that they were legally invisible, possessing no rights, or standing in a system dominated by men. This perspective suggests that women were entirely subsumed under the legal authority of their fathers or husbands, owning no property, making no contracts, and having no recourse in law. While it is true that medieval legal systems, particularly common law, often placed significant restrictions on married women, the reality was far more complex and varied. Across different regions, social classes, and legal traditions, women held a surprising array of rights and legal standing, demonstrating a level of agency that challenges the notion of universal legal powerlessness. One of the most significant areas where women, particularly widows, held substantial rights was in property ownership. Upon the death of her husband, a widow typically had a right to dower, meaning a life interest in 1/3 of her late husband's lands. This dower was an established legal right, not a favor, and she could go to court to claim it if it was denied. This gave many widows significant economic independence and the ability to manage property, collect rents, and participate in the local economy. They could enter into contracts, sue and be sued, and administer their own affairs. This legal standing was crucial for many women, enabling them to maintain their household and support their children after their husband's death. Beyond dower, single women spinsters, or femmes sole in many medieval towns and cities, enjoyed considerable legal autonomy. They could own property, enter into contracts, conduct business, and represent themselves in court. In urban centers, women were often active in various trades, from brewing and baking to silk weaving and innkeeping. The legal systems of many boroughs recognized their ability to operate independently in the marketplace. For instance, in London, a married woman could be a femme sole merchant, meaning she could conduct business separate from her husband, incur debts, and be sued in her own name for business matters. This was a crucial legal provision that allowed urban women to be active economic agents. Even for married women, femme covert, while their legal identity was often merged with their husbands under common law, there were nuances and exceptions. In some regions, especially under continental civil law traditions, married women retained more control over their own property, particularly their dowry, which was often considered her separate property and would revert to her or her family if the marriage dissolved or she was widowed. At marriage, contracts often meticulously detailed these property arrangements, ensuring the woman's financial security. The women could also sometimes act as attorneys or executors of wills, roles that required legal understanding and responsibility. Women also frequently appeared in court, not just as witnesses, but as active participants in legal disputes. Manorial court rolls are replete with cases where women were plaintiffs or defendants seeking justice for trespass, debt, assault, or defamation. Their complaints were heard, their testimonies taken, and judgments rendered based on their participation. While the legal outcomes might vary, their consistent presence in these legal forums demonstrates that they were recognized as individuals capable of engaging with the legal system. For example, a woman might bring a complaint against a neighbor for damage to her crops or demand repayment of a loan. Furthermore, women's consent was often legally required for significant transactions involving their property, especially land that was part of their dower or inheritance. Charters and deeds often show women explicitly giving their consent to sales or transfers of property, sometimes even sealing documents with their own seals, indicating their legal participation and acknowledgement. Their agreement was not just a formality, it was a necessary legal step to validate the transaction. The concept of rights in the medieval period was different from modern understandings, often tied to social status, landholding, and specific customs rather than universal human rights. However, within that framework, medieval women possessed rights and legal standing that allowed them to participate in the economic, social, and legal life of their communities. The diverse legal traditions across Europe, from the relatively restrictive common law of England to the more flexible civil law and customary laws elsewhere, provided different opportunities for female legal agency. So, while the legal landscape was undoubtedly challenging for medieval women, particularly married women, the idea that they had no legal standing or rights is a significant oversimplification. The widows and single women often enjoyed substantial property rights and legal autonomy. And urban women engaged in independent business, and women across various social strata appeared regularly in local courts, asserting their rights and pursuing legal remedies. Their presence in wills, charters, and court records clearly indicates that medieval women were not legally invisible, they were active, if sometimes restricted, participants in the legal systems of their time, exercising the rights and standing that the custom and law of their region afforded them. Number 8. Women were confined to the home and had no public life. The popular image of medieval women often traps them firmly within the domestic sphere, bustling about the household, tending to children, and managing the hearth, with little to no presence in the bustling public spaces of medieval towns and villages. This stereotype suggests that the public square, the market, the court, and the guild hall were exclusively male domains, leaving women in a state of social and economic seclusion. However, historical records reveal a dynamic and pervasive female presence in public life, demonstrating that women were active participants in markets, skilled craftswomen in various trades, property owners, and key contributors to the economic and social fabric of medieval society, far from being confined solely to private spaces. Step into a medieval market and you would find women everywhere. They were not just customers, they were vendors, selling produce from their gardens, eggs, butter, cheese, and even livestock. Aluibs were common figures, brewing and selling ale, often from their own homes but also in public markets and taverns. Fishwives, peddlers, and petty merchants, many of them women, were essential to the local economy, buying and selling goods and interacting directly with a diverse public. Their presence in these public spaces, managing their businesses, negotiating prices, and handling transactions demonstrates a vital and visible economic role that was anything but private. Market regulations and court records often mention these women, sometimes fining them for selling substandard goods, but consistently acknowledging their presence and their economic activity. Beyond the markets, women were deeply involved in a wide array of crafts and trades. While some industries were male-dominated, many others relied heavily on female labor and expertise. In the textile industry, women were crucial at every stage, spinning, weaving, fulling, dyeing, and embroidering. The production of cloth, from raw wool to finished garment, was a massive industry, and women's hands were indispensable. Guild records, while sometimes restrictive, also show women as members, sometimes inheriting their husband's trade, or, in the case of specific crafts like silk weaving or embroidery, forming their own female-dominated guilds. These women operated workshops, hired apprentices, and sold their goods, often from shops that were extensions of their homes but opened directly onto public streets, making their business visible and accessible to the public. Many women also ran inns, taverns, and lodging houses. These establishments were quintessential public spaces, hubs of social interaction, commerce, and travel. Women innkeepers were not just providing lodging, they were managing businesses, overseeing staff, dealing with travelers from all walks of life, and often serving as information hubs for their communities. Their roles required business acumen, social skills, and a constant public presence. In court records sometimes detail their disputes or even criminal activities that occurred on their premises, further highlighting their public roles. Beyond specific trades, women were also property owners and managers, which often necessitated a public presence. Widows, in particular, who inherited property or held dower rights, might manage estates, collect rents, and engage in legal matters that brought them into contact with courts, tenants, and other landholders. Their roles as landladies or overseers meant they were regularly dealing with public affairs related to their property, from negotiating leases to settling disputes. Even within the domestic sphere, women's lives were not entirely private or isolated. The medieval household often extended to the street, with open doors, shared courtyards, and frequent interactions with neighbors, peddlers, and beggars. Childbirths, deaths, marriages, and religious festivals were often communal events, bringing women into public gatherings and ceremonies. While not the formal public sphere of governance, these were undeniably public and social spaces where women were central figures. Therefore, the notion that medieval women were universally confined to the home and excluded from public life is a significant misrepresentation. From the bustling market square where they traded goods, to the workshops where they practiced skilled crafts, to the inns where they hosted travelers, women were visible and active participants in the economic and social life of their communities. Their public presence was not an exception, but a fundamental aspect of medieval society, contributing to its vibrancy and functioning in ways that defy any simplistic portrayal of their roles as purely domestic. The records of their trades, their properties, and their appearances in local courts are a testament to their undeniable and pervasive public existence. Number 9. Women left no written records. It is a deeply ingrained misconception that medieval women were largely invisible in the written record, leaving no lasting trace of their thoughts, experiences, or even their very existence in the form of self-authored documents. The assumption often arises from a focus on certain types of official, male-dominated records or a modern bias towards published literary works. This narrative suggests a profound silence that erases half of the medieval population from the historical narrative. However, a deeper examination of various archival sources reveals a surprising and rich tapestry of women's direct involvement in written culture, demonstrating that their voices, hands, and minds were indeed active in the creation and preservation of medieval written records. Consider the personal letters exchanged within families, particularly those of the nobility and gentry. The Passon Letters, a collection from a 15th century English family, are perhaps the most famous example. Within this vast correspondence, the voices of women like Agnes Passon and her daughter-in-law, Margaret Passon, ring clear. These women wrote extensively to their husbands, sons, and other family members, discussing everything from estate management, legal disputes, and financial matters to personal anxieties, family news, and domestic arrangements. Their letters are vivid, direct, and reveal their intelligence, resilience, and managerial acumen. They were not merely dictating to a male scribe, they were often writing themselves, expressing their own thoughts and decisions directly. These letters shatter any illusion of women's absence from personal correspondence. Beyond letters, women frequently left their mark in legal and administrative documents. Our wills, for instance, were a common form of self-expression for women, particularly widows and unmarried women who had the legal right to dispose of their property. These wills meticulously detail their possessions, their spiritual bequests, and their wishes for their burials. They offer intimate glimpses into the material world, their relationships, and their piety. A woman's will might include specific instructions for her clothing, jewelry, household items, or even small sums of money to friends and servants. These were personal declarations, directly articulating their desires and their legacy, often penned by or for them, but conveying their precise intentions. Petitions to secular or ecclesiastical authorities also bear the voices of women. Whether seeking legal redress, financial aid, or special favors, women wrote or had written on their behalf direct appeals that laid out their cases, their grievances, and their requests. These documents, preserved in royal archives or church records, demonstrate women actively engaging with the legal and political systems, articulating their needs and seeking justice. Their petitions were formal statements intended to influence powerful figures and secure outcomes. Women also contributed directly to the creation of literary and scholarly works. Christine de Pizan, living from the late 14th to the early 15th century, stands out as one of the first professional female authors in Europe. She wrote extensively on topics ranging from history and politics to morality and women's rights, including her famous The Book of the City of Ladies, which eloquently defended women's capabilities and contributions throughout history. Her works were highly regarded, circulated widely, and demonstrate a sophisticated intellectual voice. Other women, like Hrotsvita of Gandersheim in the 10th century, wrote Latin dramas and poetry, often within a monastic setting, demonstrating intellectual engagement and creative output. Within convents, women were not only readers, but also active producers of written materials. and nuns, copied manuscripts and scriptoria, sometimes illuminating them with intricate designs. They kept chronicles of their own communities, detailing important events, spiritual lives, and administrative matters. These monastic records provide valuable insights into female spiritual experiences and the daily functioning of female-run institutions. The theological and mystical writings of figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich represent profound intellectual contributions carefully transcribed and preserved often by other women. Moreover, even seemingly mundane records can reveal women's written presence. Account books kept by wives managing estates or businesses sometimes show women's direct handwriting, demonstrating their practical literacy and their involvement in financial record keeping. The inclusion of women's names and transactions in manorial court rolls, guild records, and town registers, while not self-authored narratives, points to their consistent presence in the written administrative life of the period. The belief that medieval women left no written records is a myth easily dispelled by the sheer volume and variety of documents that bear their direct or indirect influence. From personal letters and legal wills that articulate their individual desires, to literary works that advocate for their sex, to administrative records that confirm their daily activities, women's voices are embedded within the parchment, ink, and wax of the medieval age. Their direct participation in written culture, though sometimes overlooked, is a testament to their active engagement with the world and a powerful rebuttal to the idea of their historical silence.